Hi, this is Mrs. Hanson, your online psychology instructor, and I'm filming my second mini lecture on Chapter 5 about different models of learning. This mini lecture will focus on classical conditioning, the principles and the terminology of classical conditioning, which was discovered by Ivan Pavlov, in Russia. Pavlov wasn't a psychologist or a psychiatrist. He was a medical doctor doing research on digestion, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize, as a matter of fact, for his research on digestion. My hair is annoying me. um, so he was studying digestion using dogs because it's pretty hard to study salivation in humans. At the time Pavlov was doing his research, no one knew about the digestive properties of saliva. Everybody assumed digestion began in the stomach. And of course, we know that digestion begins in the mouth with saliva starting to break down food. So Pavlov was studying salivation. Basically, he was studying drooling. He was collecting drool in little drool tubes attached by a harness to dogs. And he was measuring the amount of saliva generated by a stimulus, and that stimulus was food. He used meat powder, which is kind of like bouillon, beef bouillon ground up, so you can exactly measure the same amount of stimulus for each dog. Now, physiologically, every uh, every human and dog will salivate when food is introduced to the mouth, on the tongue. It's a physiologic response. It's not learned, it's innate, and that's why we call it an unconditioned stimulus, the food, and an unconditioned response, salivation, to the food. Because they don't need conditioning. They're innately occurring. They're unconditioned behaviors. They don't need conditioning. They already occur by reflex. What Pavlov discovered was that the dogs were starting to associate other stimuli with the arrival of the food. For instance, perhaps the footsteps of down the hallway, or the white lab coats that the assistants would wear. The dogs would associate these other stimuli as signals that food was going to be delivered soon. Perhaps your pets at home know exactly when you're about to feed them because they have learned to associate the sound of the can opener or a particular cabinet being opened. They know when food is going to appear because they have learned to associate that stimulus, a sound or a location or some behavior of yours, with getting fed, with getting food. These new stimuli end up being called conditioned stimuli, and they will evoke a conditioned response. So in Pavlov's dog situation, Pavlov tried lots of different, stimuli to become conditioned, by being paired with the food. The metronome, which a lot of people don't know today what it is, but it's a timekeeper, and it kind of tick-tocks back and forth to a rhythm. And in the reenactment video that I posted for you, you can see a recreation of Pavlov using the metronome as a conditioned stimulus. He would turn that on just prior to feeding the dogs the food, and eventually the dogs learned to associate the metronome with the arrival of food, and they started salivating early, which is physiologically wrong. They shouldn't physiologically salivate until they get the food, but this is the brilliance of Pavlov. He said, this is very interesting. These dogs are salivating early. They're having a response they shouldn't really be having physiologically. So it's a psychological, conditioned response. Now, those stimuli, like the metronome, they actually begin as neutral stimuli. They're neutral because until the conditioning occurs, they cannot elicit a response. The conditioning is the pairing of the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, the food. And after repeated trials, eventually that pairing forms the association, and eventually that neutral stimulus becomes conditioned, a conditioned stimulus. So now the dogs drool at the sound of the metronome, and the metronome is the conditioned stimulus, and the drooling to the metronome is a conditioned response. So let's review the terminology. The unconditioned stimulus is the food. The unconditioned response is salivation to the food. Those are not learned. That's why we call them unconditioned. And then the neutral stimulus is selected by the trainer, and it begins as neutral because until the conditioning occurs, it can't elicit a response. It's just neutral. But by pairing that neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, like the food, over and over again, eventually it will become conditioned. It'll become a conditioned stimulus, and it will evoke a conditioned response. Now, emotional reactions are conditioned this way very frequently. Think of a song that was neutral, meant nothing to you emotionally, until perhaps it became a song that you associate with a previous lover, for instance. And your feelings about that song were conditioned by association with that person. So I don't know if it ended well or ended badly. If it ended badly, you don't like that song because you associate it with that lover. And if it ended well, then it's your favorite song. It's your, it's our song, right? Isn't that cute? So all kinds of conditioned emotional responses occur when we associate previously neutral stimuli with something that naturally elicits a response. This is why advertisers use sex to sell. The products themselves begin as neutral, but the advertiser pairs the product with sex. You have an emotional response to the sexual stimuli. It provokes a positive emotional response in you. And what the advertiser wants is for you to have that same positive emotional response to the product. The product began as neutral, then it gets associated with sex, then you have a positive emotional response, maybe a sexual response to the product. I doubt you're having an actual sexual response, but you have a positive emotional response. Songs become associated. Places become associated. Places become conditioned stimuli. If you've ever had an accident at a particular intersection, you associate that intersection with the accident. And the accident evoked a certain emotional response, which is anxiety and pain and fear. And so perhaps many of you know what that's like then, to even drive by a location where you had a bad accident and you start feeling anxious. You start feeling, some of the same emotional responses you had to the original event. This is how PTSD triggers occur. Someone with PTSD, veterans, for example, they may hear sounds that trigger emotional responses from the war experience, and then they are flooded with some very powerful emotional responses, which other people may not understand. But if you get that learning by association, that certain sounds are associated with very powerful events, then you understand PTSD in veterans. One of my former boyfriends was a Vietnam vet, and he associated the sound of helicopters, of course, with the fighting. And even though he was home for several years after Vietnam, every time a police helicopter flew over his apartment in Fresno looking for bad people, he would have flashbacks to the Vietnam War, and it was not a good scene for him for a while. It took him a while to calm down. He also learned by association that forests, kind of dense undergrowth, jungly type vegetation can trigger flashbacks as well. Why? Because Vietnam has lots of lush undergrowth, rainforest type vegetation. When he's home and the war is over, if he is in a place, and in fact we did go to Mendocino, which is very lush, and we were walking on a trail in a forest, and it had a lot of ferns and growth, and it was very similar to the jungle in Vietnam, and he had a flashback right on the hiking trail. And he was hiding from snipers, as a matter of fact, and it was very upsetting for him, and of course concerned me and upset me as well that he was having flashbacks like that. Flashbacks are all about conditioned stimuli. Before Vietnam, vegetation, jungly vegetation didn't have an emotional meaning to him. But because that vegetation is associated with the fighting of the Vietnam War, now it evokes a strong emotional response in him. I haven't seen him in a long time, so I'm hoping he got over that. But lots of us have conditioned emotional responses. So I'd like you to think about what types of previously neutral stimuli became conditioned stimuli for some emotional response that you have. Could be the scent of a certain perfume that you associate with your mother. It could be a song, as I said, that you associate with a lover. It could be that intersection that you associate with a bad experience. It could be all sorts of things. I hope this helps you understand the terminology. I'll say them again. The neutral stimulus, which later becomes the conditioned stimulus by being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned stimuli evoke or elicit unconditioned responses. Those occur naturally without any learning. Through repeated pairings of the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, eventually that neutral stimulus becomes conditioned, a conditioned stimulus evoking a conditioned response. That covers classical conditioning in this mini lecture. Good luck to you on Chapter 5, and good luck on the test.